Ukraine crisis affect Taiwan? Well, today I speak with Dan Blumenthal, the author of The China Nightmare and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a prominent think tank in Washington, D.C. He was also a senior director of China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the U.S. Department of Defense. Well, Dan, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
How is everything in Washington, D.C.? It must be very tense over there.
Well, it's shocking. Yeah, nobody really thought that one big country would just go in and attack and invade and occupy another country, but it's happened, and so we're truly in a new era.
How do you think this will end?
Unfortunately, I think it'll end with Russia occupying Ukraine and the U.S. having to reinforce containing that threat on the eastern flank to Poland and elsewhere.
You recently wrote an article about how Beijing could learn from Russia's playbook in terms of Ukraine. Can you tell us how you think the Ukraine crisis could affect Taiwan?
Yes, I think China has options to threaten mass uses of force and to coerce Taiwan, but more importantly, to intimidate the United States into thinking that defending Taiwan would cause a very big and protracted war. And in so doing, they would try to make political demands of Washington to put pressure on Taipei to accept China's policy on Taiwan. I think China is watching very carefully to see how the United States and NATO respond to this aggression.
So how do you think the U.S. needs to respond to what's happening in Ukraine in order to deter China from becoming more aggressive towards Taiwan?
Well, I mean, there are many things that we haven't done right for many years, so it's a bit late. But I think sanctions, very crippling sanctions that punish the Russian economy badly, and keeping the allies on board with those sanctions, as well as accelerated lethal aid to the Ukrainian military, the training of the Ukrainian military, the continued advisory troops inside the Ukraine, as well as reinforcing the flanks of NATO, all of which is happening, although the crippling economic sanctions are fairly slow to be rolled out.
Well, in your article, you mentioned that the U.S. should have a stronger military presence in Taiwan to deter China. Do you think that will be happening with the Biden administration?
Well, I actually said it should train a small force to be ready to go into Taiwan at the first sign of a crisis, which would just be the acceleration of existing programs that the United States already has. But my point was, if we're going to be able to influence events in a crisis and maintain Taiwan's political will, help shore up its ability to communicate, very importantly, as we see with the Ukraine crisis, communicate with its population, with the rest of the world, I think we're going to need to have people in Taiwan fairly quickly.
If China were to attack Taiwan, what do you think the U.S. would do?
The U.S. would likely first try to help with its defense and then come to its defense. But my point in my article is that it's not going to be so easy to just come to Taiwan's defense. There's going to be some kind of crisis, and it's going to take diplomacy, which will be much harder in the Taiwan case, I view it, and then in the Ukraine case. There's going to be immense needs for coordination between the United States and Taiwan, and the United States and Taiwan, and whatever coalition decides to join in. So I argue in that article in Foreign Policy that we need to be doing things now to prepare for not just a military crisis, but a diplomatic military crisis.
You also said that Taiwan doesn't have a NATO, and there's no real security guarantees for Taiwan. So what do you think other countries should be doing to help deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan?
Well, I mean, very few other countries are going to do anything unless the United States convinces them that it's necessary to do so. So Japan obviously is changing its policy somewhat, and Japan has to, for the United States to succeed, Japan has to, at the very least, provide use of its bases. Hopefully it'll do more than that in terms of military commitments. Australia talks about the same sort of thing, but the United States needs to be much more proactive in building a coalition and explaining to this coalition why it's necessary to resist aggression in the Taiwan Strait.
Russia and China recently signed a long-term agreement, so this greater show of solidarity is pretty threatening. What kind of impact do you think it might have on Taiwan?
Well, I mean, the key question is Russia going to support China if it takes aggressive action on Taiwan? And I guess we're leaning towards the answer, which is yes. And so that is troubling. On the other hand, I would say China has been much more cautious in practice on supporting Russia. So, it certainly will help Russia in terms of importing more goods from Russia during a time of sanctions. It buys a lot of energy from Russia, but it's not diplomatically supporting the attack on Ukraine. So we'll have to see. It's a little bit more complicated than it seems at first glance.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for your time. I've been speaking with Dan Blumenthal. He's the author of The China Nightmare. He is also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a Washington think tank in Washington.
Thank you so much.